Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 23, Simple Reproduction from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So first of all, congratulations on making it this far. Chapter 23 is the first of 3 chapters in the second to last section of Kapital, Part 7, the Accumulation of Capital. That means that after this section, which concerns how surplus value is turned into capital and continually reinvested to make more and more capital, there's only one more part to go, Part 8, which concerns primitive accumulation or the conditions whereby capitalism was set up in the first place. In this chapter, though, which is titled Simple Reproduction, we're going to discuss a scenario in which a capitalist system, once established, continues on a constant scale. In other words, it doesn't expand. In this scenario, you do have a capitalist class exploiting the labor of a working class, but rather than taking the surplus value and using it to extend capital further, they just take the surplus value generated and spend it. They use it for consumption. In this scenario, workers still get up and they work and they get their wage, which basically only covers the cost of subsistence, and part of their workday is still necessary labor time and part of it is surplus labor time. But the capital, rather than expanding, is just simply renewed and replaced, held constant. Then in chapter 24, the next chapter, we're going to talk about when it is reinvested in an expansive reproduction process in which capital grows. And then finally, chapter 25 is the second longest chapter in the book. That is titled The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation, and it's a very important chapter to understand. Otherwise, throughout this part and this chapter, Marx's main points remain the same, that capitalism is a system of exploitation, but that in contrast to some of the earlier modes of production in class society, it is more sophisticated and is better able to conceal its exploitation of labor, which gives more terrain for its apologists and propagandists to put out the false notion that capitalism is a natural and timeless system rather than one that depends on really particular socio-historic technological conditions in order to emerge, and also that it's a purely voluntary system without coercion or exploitation and all the other things that you've heard from libertarians and other free market fantasists. So in other words, what we get into here in parts 7 and 8 are really the climax of the work. If you've understood things up to now, you can think of the next 2 parts as the payoff of the book, and if you are a little bit shaky on some of the things, do listen to these parts, see if anything snaps into place for you, and then when you listen to the whole thing again, maybe then when you go back around to parts 1 and 2, parts 7 and 8 will help you see it in the proper context. Alright, let's begin. Part 7. The Accumulation of Capital. The conversion of a sum of money into means of production and labor power is the first step taken by the quantum of value that is going to function as capital. This conversion takes place in the market within the sphere of circulation. The second step, the process of production, is complete so soon as the means of production have been converted into commodities whose value exceeds that of their component parts, and therefore contains the capital originally advanced plus a surplus value. These commodities must then be thrown into circulation. They must be sold, their value realized in money. This money afresh converted into capital, and so over and over again. This circular movement, in which the same phases are continually gone through in succession, forms the circulation of capital. The first condition of accumulation is that the capitalist must have contrived to sell their commodities and to reconvert into capital the greater part of the money so received. Comment, remember the formula M to C to M prime. Start with money, use it to get commodities, use the commodities to get more money than you started with. Continuing, in the following pages we shall assume that capital circulates in its normal way. The detailed analysis of the process will be found in Book 2. The capitalist who produces surplus value, i.e. who extracts unpaid labor directly from the laborers and fixes it in commodities, is indeed the first appropriator, but by no means the ultimate owner of the surplus value. They have to share it with capitalists, with landowners, etc., who fulfill other functions in the complex of social production. Surplus value therefore splits up into various parts. Its fragments fall to various categories of persons and take various forms, independent the one of the other, such as profit, interest, merchant's profit, rent, etc. It is only in Book 3 that we can take in hand these modified forms of surplus value. On the one hand, then, we assume that the capitalist sells at their value the commodities they have produced, without concerning ourselves either about the new forms that capital assumes while in the sphere of circulation, or about the concrete conditions of reproduction hidden under these forms. On the other hand, we treat the capitalist producer as owner of the entire surplus value, or better perhaps, as the representative of all the sharers with them in the booty. We therefore first of all consider accumulation from an abstract point of view, i.e. as a mere phase in the actual process of production. So far as accumulation takes place, the capitalist must have succeeded in selling their commodities, and in reconverting the sale money into capital. Moreover, the breaking up of surplus value into fragments neither alters its nature nor the conditions under which it becomes an element of accumulation. Whatever be the proportion of surplus value which the industrial capitalist retains for themselves or yields up to others, they are the one who, in the first instance, appropriates it. We therefore assume no more than what actually takes place. On the other hand, the simple fundamental form of the process of accumulation is obscured by the incident of the circulation which brings it about, and by the splitting up of surplus value. An exact analysis of the process, therefore, demands that we should, for a time, disregard all phenomena that hide the play of its inner mechanism. So commenting, that is the end of Marx's introduction to Part 7. What he's talking about here in terms of trying to separate the process of producing surplus value from the process of the capitalist once they have that surplus value in hand through the robbery of the workers at the point of production, having to share portions of that surplus value with other people, whether it's a landlord, whether it's a creditor who gave them a loan and now they have to pay them back with interest, etc. What Marx is talking about is we're going to start out just looking at that process of producing the surplus value. As Marx says there at the end, the simple fundamental form of the process of accumulation is obscured or made indistinct, harder to see, by the incident of the circulation which brings it about and by the splitting up of surplus value. So what we're going to do is, quote, for a time, disregard all phenomena that hide the play of the inner mechanism. So while chapters 24 and 25 are going to get into some more complicated scenarios, and then, as Marx says, in the later volumes of Kapital, he will continue to probe into different aspects of the phenomena. Where we're going to start in chapter 23 is just like the chapter is titled, Simple Reproduction, a scenario in which there are not a lot of complicated outside circumstances considered, but kind of a scaled down hypothetical of the core of the process. So let's begin with that. Chapter 23, Simple Reproduction. Whatever the form of the process of production in a society, it must be a continuous process, must continue to go periodically through the same phases. A society can no more cease to produce than it can cease to consume. When viewed, therefore, as a connected whole, and as flowing on with incessant renewal, every social process of production is, at the same time, a process of reproduction. The conditions of production are also those of reproduction. No society can go on producing. In other words, no society can reproduce unless it constantly reconverts a part of its products into means of production, or elements of fresh products. All other circumstances remaining the same, the only mode by which it can reproduce its wealth and maintain it at one level is by replacing the means of production, i.e. the instruments of labor, the raw material, and the auxiliary substances consumed in the course of the year, by an equal quantity of the same kind of articles. These must be separated from the mass of the early products and thrown afresh into the process of production. Hence, a definite portion of each year's product belongs to the domain of production. Destined for productive consumption from the very first, this portion exists, for the most part, in the shape of articles totally unfitted for individual consumption. If production be capitalistic in form, so too will be reproduction. Just as in the former the labor process figures but as a means toward the self-expansion of capital, so in the latter it figures but as a means of reproducing as capital, i.e. as self-expanding value, the value advanced. It is only because their money constantly functions as capital that the economic guise of a capitalist attaches to a person. Comment, let's read that again. It is only because their money constantly functions as capital that the economic guise of a capitalist attaches to a person. Continuing, if for instance a sum of £100 has this year been converted into capital and produced a surplus value of £20, it must continue during next year and subsequent years to repeat the same operation. As a periodic increment of the capital advanced, or periodic fruit of capital in process, surplus value acquires the form of a revenue flowing out of capital. Footnote quoting Sismondi's New Principles of Political Economy, 1819, the rich who consume the labor of others can only obtain them by making exchanges, by giving away their acquired and accumulated wealth in exchange for the new products which are the object of their capricious wishes. They seem to be exposed to an early exhaustion of their reserve fund. We have already said that they do not work and are unable to work. Therefore, it could be assumed with full justification that their former wealth would be diminishing every day, and that finally a day would come when they would have nothing, and they would have nothing to offer to the workers who work exclusively for them. But in the social order, wealth has acquired the power of reproducing itself through the labor of others without the help of its owners. Wealth, like labor and by means of labor, bears fruit every year, but this fruit can be destroyed every year without making the rich man any poorer thereby. This fruit is the revenue which arises out of capital. Unquote, back to the main text. If this revenue serve the capitalist only as a fund to provide for their consumption and be spent as periodically as it is gained, then everything else being the same, simple reproduction will take place. And although this reproduction is a mere repetition of the process of production on the old scale, yet this mere repetition, or continuity, gives a new character to the process, or rather causes the disappearance of some apparent characteristics which it possessed as an isolated, discontinuous process. The purchase of labor power for a fixed period is the prelude to the process of production, and this prelude is constantly repeated when the stipulated term comes to an end, when a definite period of production, such as a week or a month, has elapsed. But the laborer is not paid until after they have expended their labor power, and realized in commodities not only its value but surplus value. They have therefore produced not only surplus value, which we for the present regard as a fund to meet the private consumption of the capitalist, but they have also produced, before it flows back to them in the shape of wages, the fund out of which they themselves are paid, the variable capital, and their employment lasts only so long as they continue to reproduce this fund. Hence that formula of the economists, referred to in Chapter 18, which represents wages as a share in the product itself. Footnote quoting Ramsey, wages as well as profits are to be considered, each of them, as really a portion of the finished product. And quoting J. Mill, 1823, the share of the product which comes to the laborer in the form of wages. Unquote, back to the main text. What flows back to the laborer in the shape of wages is a portion of the product that is continuously reproduced by them. The capitalist, it's true, pays them in money, but this money is merely the transmuted form of the product of their labor. While they're converting a portion of the means of production into products, a portion of their former product is being turned into money. It is their labor of last week or of last year that pays for their labor power this week or this year. The illusion begotten by the intervention of money vanishes immediately if, instead of taking a single capitalist and a single laborer, we take the class of capitalists and the class of laborers as a whole. The capitalist class is constantly giving to the laboring class order notes in the form of money on a portion of the commodities produced by the latter and appropriated by the former. The laborers give these order notes back just as constantly to the capitalist class, and in this way get their share of their own product. The transaction is veiled by the commodity form of the product and the money form of the commodity. So commenting, this is another major point that Marx keeps making throughout this work, that the mechanics of capitalism obscure the processes that are actually taking place, this being an example. Continuing. Variable capital is therefore only a particular historical form of appearance of the fund for providing the necessaries of life, or the labor fund which the laborer requires for the maintenance of themselves and family, and which, whatever be the system of social production, they must themselves produce and reproduce. If the labor fund constantly flows to them in the form of money that pays for their labor, it is because the product they have created moves constantly away from them in the form of capital. But all this does not alter the fact that it is the laborer's own labor, realized in a product which is advanced to them by the capitalist. So commenting, again, it looks tricky because of the commodity form of the product and the money form of the commodity. But really, it's simple. It's the same thing that happens in every period of history, whether in capitalism or not. People and their dependents need to eat and, live. This requires supplies which are produced by labor. That's, again, a constant. That's always the case. But in capitalism, the labor fund comes to the workers in the form of money that is paying for the work that they're doing, but it's because the product that they're making is being confiscated by the capitalist and then held until money is provided to reclaim some of it. And again, don't think of it of like an individual shop, because you might be making springs and you have no particular personal use for springs. Look at it in terms of the entire capitalist class and the entire working class being subject collectively to these dynamics. Continuing, there's a footnote quoting Cazenove in a note to his edition of Malthus's Definitions in Political Economy. When capital is employed in advancing to the workman his wages, it adds nothing to the funds for the maintenance of labor. Unquote, back to the main text. Let us take a peasant liable to do compulsory service for their lord. They work on their own land, with their own means of production, for say 3 days a week. The other 3 days they do forced work on the lord's domain. They constantly reproduce their own labor fund, which never, in their case, takes the form of a money payment for their labor advanced by another person. But in return, their unpaid forced labor for the lord on its side never acquires the character of voluntary paid labor. If one fine morning the lord appropriates to himself the land, the cattle, the seed, in a word, the means of production of this peasant, the latter will thenceforth be obliged to sell their labor power to the lord. They will, all things being equal, labor 6 days a week as before, 3 for themselves, 3 for the lord, who thenceforth becomes a wages-paying capitalist. As before, they will use up the means of production as means of production and transfer their value to the product. As before, a definite portion of the product will be devoted to reproduction. But from the moment that the forced labor is changed into wage labor, from that moment the labor fund, which the peasant himself continues as before to produce and reproduce, takes the form of a capital advanced in the form of wages by the lord. The bourgeois economist whose narrow mind is unable to separate the form of appearance from the thing that appears shuts their eyes to the fact that it is but here and there on the face of the earth that even nowadays the labor fund crops up in the form of capital. Footnote quoting Richard Jones' Textbook of Lectures on the Political Economy of Nations, 1852, the wages of labor are advanced by capitalists in the case of less than 1/4 of the laborers of the earth. Unquote. So commenting, in other words, at that point, that was the extent to which capitalism had spread itself. Or in other words, more than 3/4 of the world population was not yet living under capitalism, at least directly, and being paid in this way and obtaining the necessities of life in this way. Continuing back to the main text, variable capital, it is true, only then loses its character of a value advanced out of the capitalist's funds when we view the process of capitalist production in the flow of its constant renewal. But that process must have had a beginning of some kind. From our present standpoint, it therefore seems likely that the capitalist, once upon a time, became possessed of money by some accumulation that took place independently of the unpaid labor of others, and that this was, therefore, how they were enabled to frequent the market as a buyer of labor power. However this may be, the mere continuity of the process, the simple reproduction, brings about some other wonderful changes which affect not only the variable, but the total capital. If a capital of £1,000 begets yearly a surplus value of £200, and if the surplus value be consumed every year, it is clear that at the end of 5 years, the surplus value consumed will amount to 5 times £200, or the £1,000 originally advanced. If only a part, say 1/2, were consumed, the same result would follow at the end of 10 years, since 10 times £100 equals £1,000. General rule: the value of the capital advanced, divided by the surplus value annually consumed, gives the number of years or reproduction periods at the expiration of which the capital originally advanced has been consumed by the capitalist and has disappeared. The capitalist thinks that they are consuming the produce of the unpaid labor of others, i.e. the surplus value, and is keeping intact their original capital, but what they think cannot alter facts. After the lapse of a certain number of years, the capital value they then possess is equal to the sum total of the surplus value appropriated by them during those years, and the total value they've consumed is equal to that of their original capital. It is true they have in hand a capital whose amount has not changed, and of which a part, viz. The buildings, machinery, etc., were already there when the work of their business began. But what we have to do with here is not the material elements, but the value of that capital. When a person gets through all their property by taking upon themselves debts equal to the value of that property, it is clear that their property represents nothing but the total sum of their debts. And so it is with the capitalist. When they have consumed the equivalent of their original capital, the value of their present capital represents nothing but the total amount of the surplus value appropriated by them without payment. Not a single atom of the value of their old capital continues to exist. Apart then from all accumulation, the mere continuity of the process of production, in other words simple reproduction, sooner or later and of necessity converts every capital into accumulated capital, or capitalized surplus value. Even if that capital was originally acquired by the personal labor of its employer, it sooner or later becomes value appropriated without an equivalent, the unpaid labor of others, materialized either in money or in some other object. We saw in chapters 4 through 6, comment in other words, part 2 of 8, continuing that in order to convert money into capital, something more is required than the production and circulation of commodities. We saw that on the one side, the possessor of value or money, and on the other, the possessor of the value-creating substance. On the one side, the possessor of the means of production and subsistence. On the other, the possessor of nothing but labor power must confront one another as buyer and seller. The separation of labor from its product, of subjective labor power from the objective conditions of labor, was therefore the real foundation in fact and the starting point of capitalist production. But that which at first was but a starting point becomes, by the mere continuity of the process, by simple reproduction, the peculiar result, constantly renewed and perpetuated, of capitalist production. On the one hand, the process of production incessantly converts material wealth into capital, into means of creating more wealth, and means of enjoyment for the capitalist. On the other hand, the laborer, on quitting the process, is what they were on entering it, a source of wealth, but devoid of all means of making that wealth their own. Since, before entering on the process, their own labor has already been alienated from themselves by the sale of their labor power, has been appropriated by the capitalist, and incorporated with capital, it must, during the process, be realized in a product that does not belong to the laborer. Since the process of production is also the process by which the capitalist consumes labor power, the product of the laborer is incessantly converted not only into commodities but into capital, into value that sucks up the value-creating power, into means of subsistence that buy the person of the laborer, into means of production that command the producers. Footnote quoting James Mill, this is a remarkably peculiar property of productive labor. Whatever is productively consumed is capital, and it becomes capital by consumption, unquote. James Mill, however, never got on the track of this remarkably peculiar property. Back to the main text. The laborer therefore constantly produces material, objective wealth, but in the form of capital, of an alien power that dominates and exploits them. And the capitalist as constantly produces labor power, but in the form of a subjective source of wealth separated from the objects in and by which it alone can be realized. In short, the capitalist produces the laborer, but as a wage laborer. Footnote quoting Reasons for a Limited Exportation of Wool, London, 1677, it is true indeed that the first to introduce a manufacture employs many poor, but they cease not to be so, and the continuance of it makes many. And quoting Reasons for the Late Increase of the Poor Rates or a Comparative View of the Prices of Labor and Provisions, London, 1777, the farmer now absurdly asserts that he keeps the poor. They are indeed kept in misery. Unquote, back to the main text. This incessant reproduction, this perpetuation of the laborer, is the sine qua non of capitalist production. The laborer consumes in a twofold way. While producing, they consume by their labor the means of production, and convert them into products with a higher value than that of the capital advanced. This is their productive consumption. It is at the same time consumption of their labor power by the capitalist who bought it. On the other hand, the laborer turns the money paid to them for their labor power into means of subsistence. This is their individual consumption. The laborer's productive consumption and their individual consumption are therefore totally distinct. In the former, they act as the motive power of capital and belong to the capitalist. In the latter, they belong to themselves and perform their necessary vital functions outside the process of production. The result of the one is that the capitalist lives, of the other, that the laborer lives. When treating of the working day, we saw that the laborer is often compelled to make their individual consumption a mere incident of production. In such a case, they supply themselves with necessaries in order to maintain their labor power, just as coal and water are supplied to the steam engine and oil to the wheel. Their means of consumption, in that case, are the mere means of consumption required by a means of production. Their individual consumption is directly productive consumption. This, however, appears to be an abuse not essentially appertaining to capitalist production. Footnote, Rossi would not declaim so emphatically against this had he really penetrated the secret of productive consumption. Back to the main text. The matter takes quite another aspect when we contemplate not the single capitalist and the single laborer, but the capitalist class and the laboring class. Not an isolated process of production, but capitalist production in full swing and on its actual social scale. By converting part of their capital into labor power, the capitalist augments the value of their entire capital. They kill two birds with one stone. They profit not only by what they receive from, but also by what they give to the laborer. The capital given in exchange for labor power is converted into necessaries, by the consumption of which the muscles, nerves, bones, and brains of existing laborers are reproduced and new laborers are begotten. Within the limits of what is strictly necessary, the individual consumption of the working class is, therefore, the reconversion of the means of subsistence given by capital in exchange for labor power into fresh labor power at the disposal of capital for exploitation. It is the production and reproduction of that means of production so indispensable to the capitalist, the laborer themselves. The individual consumption of the laborer, whether it proceed within the workshop or outside it, whether it be part of the process of production or not, forms therefore a factor of the production and reproduction of capital, just as cleaning machinery does, whether it be done while the machinery is working or while it is standing. The fact that the laborer consumes their means of subsistence for their own purposes and not to please the capitalist has no bearing on the matter. The consumption of food by a beast of burden is nonetheless a necessary factor in the process of production because the beast enjoys what it eats. The maintenance and reproduction of the working class is, and must ever be, a necessary condition to the reproduction of capital. But the capitalist may safely leave its fulfillment to the laborer's instincts of self-preservation and of propagation. All the capitalist cares for is to reduce the laborer's individual consumption as far as possible to what is strictly necessary, and they are far away from imitating those brutal South Americans who force their laborers to take the more substantial rather than the less substantial kind of food. Footnote quoting Liebig, the laborers in the mines of South America, whose daily task, the heaviest perhaps in the world, consists in bringing to the surface on their shoulders a load of metal weighing from 180 to 200 pounds from a depth of 450 feet, live on bread and beans only. They themselves would prefer the bread alone for food, but their masters, who have found out that the men cannot work so hard on bread, treat them like horses and compel them to eat beans. Beans, however, are relatively much richer in bone earth, phosphate of lime, than is bread. Unquote. Back to the main text. Hence, both the capitalist and their ideological representative, the political economist, consider that part alone of the laborer's individual consumption to be productive which is requisite for the perpetuation of the class, and which therefore must take place in order that the capitalist may have labor power to consume. What the laborer consumes for their own pleasure beyond that part is unproductive consumption. If the accumulation of capital were to cause a rise of wages and an increase in the laborer's consumption, unaccompanied by an increase in the consumption of labor power by capital, the additional capital would be consumed unproductively. Footnote quoting Ricardo, if the price of labor should rise so high that notwithstanding the increase of capital, no more could be employed, I should say that such increase of capital would still be unproductively consumed. Unquote. Back to the main text. In reality, the individual consumption of the laborer is unproductive as regards themselves, for it reproduces nothing but the needy individual. It is productive to the capitalist and to the state, since it is the production of the power that creates their wealth. Footnote quoting Malthus's definitions, etc., the only productive consumption, properly so called, is the consumption or destruction of wealth. Marx adds, he alludes to the means of production, quote, by capitalists with a view to reproduction. The workman is a productive consumer to the person who employs him, and to the state, but not, strictly speaking, to himself. Unquote. Back to the main text. From a social point of view, therefore, the working class, even when not directly engaged in the labor process, is just as much an appendage of capital as the ordinary instruments of labor. Even its individual consumption is, within certain limits, a mere factor in the process of production. That process, however, takes good care to prevent these self-conscious instruments from leaving it in the lurch, for it removes their product as fast as it is made from their pole to the opposite pole of capital. Individual consumption provides, on the one hand, the means for their maintenance and reproduction. On the other hand, it secures, by the annihilation of the necessaries of life, the continued reappearance of the worker in the labor market. The Roman slave was held by fetters. The wage laborer is bound to their owner by invisible threads. The appearance of independence is kept up by means of a constant change of employers and by the fictio juris of a contract. In former times, capital resorted to legislation whenever necessary to enforce its proprietary rights over the free laborer. For instance, down to 1815, the emigration of mechanics employed in machine-making was, in England, forbidden under grievous pains and penalties. The reproduction of the working class carries with it the accumulation of skill that is handed down from one generation to another. Footnote quoting Thomas Hodgkin's Labor Defended, etc., the only thing of which one can say that it is stored up and prepared beforehand is the skill of the laborer. The accumulation and storage of skilled labor, that most important question, is, as regards the great mass of laborers, accomplished without any capital whatever. Unquote. Back to the main text. to what extent the capitalist reckons the existence of such a skilled class among the factors of production that belong to them by right, and to what extent they actually regard it as the reality of their variable capital, is seen so soon as a crisis threatens them with its loss. In consequence of the Civil War in the United States and of the accompanying cotton famine, the majority of the cotton operatives in Lancashire were, as is well known, thrown out of work. Both from the working class itself and from other ranks of society, there arose a cry for state aid, or for voluntary national subscriptions, in order to enable the, quote, superfluous hands to emigrate to the colonies or to the United States. Thereupon, the Times published on the 24th March, 1863, a letter from Edmund Potter, a former president of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce. The letter was rightly called in the House of Commons the Manufacturers' Manifesto, as in Farrand's Motion on the Cotton Famine. We call here a few characteristic passages in which the proprietary rights of capital over labor power are unblushingly asserted. Quote, he, meaning the man out of work, may be told the supply of cotton workers is too large and must in fact be reduced by a third perhaps, and that then there will be a healthy demand for the remaining two-thirds. Public opinion urges emigration. The master cannot willingly see their labor supply being removed. They may think, and perhaps justly, that it is both wrong and unsound. But if the public funds are to be devoted to assist emigration, he has a right to be heard and perhaps to protest. Unquote. Mr. Potter then shows how useful the cotton trade is, how the, quote, trade has undoubtedly drawn the surplus population from Ireland and from the agricultural districts, unquote. How immense is its extent, how in the year 1860 it yielded 5/13 of the total English exports, how after a few years it will again expand by the extension of the market, particularly of the Indian market. Comment, so many uses for the colonies found in this passage, continuing, and by calling forth a plentiful supply of cotton at 6d. per pound. He then continues, quote, some time, 1, 2, or 3 years it may be, will produce the quantity. The question I would put then is this: is the trade worth retaining? Is it worthwhile to keep the machinery, he means the living labor machines, in order? And is it not the greatest folly to think of parting with that? I think it is. I allow that the workers are not a property, not the property of Lancashire and the masters, but they are the strength of both. They are the mental and trained power which cannot be replaced for a generation. The mere machinery which they work might much of it be beneficially replaced, nay improved, in a 12-month. Footnote, it will not be forgotten that this same capital sings quite another song under ordinary circumstances when there's a question of reducing wages. Then the masters exclaim with one voice, the factory operatives should keep in wholesome remembrance the fact that theirs is really a low species of skilled labor, and that there is none which is more easily acquired, or of its quality more amply remunerated, or which, by a short training of the least expert, can be more quickly as well as abundantly acquired. The master's machinery, Marx adds, which we now learn can be replaced with advantage in 12 months, quote, really plays a far more important part in the business of production than the labor and skill of the operative, Marx adds, who cannot now be replaced under 30 years, quote, which 6 months' education can reach and a common laborer can learn, unquote, and as was quoted in an earlier chapter. Back to the main text and continuing this quoted passage. Encourage or allow, comment, yes, allow, like the entire country is just a big prison. Continuing, the working power to emigrate, and what of the capitalist? Take away the cream of the workers, and fixed capital will depreciate in a great degree, and the floating will not subject itself to a struggle with the short supply of inferior labor. We are told that the workers wish it, meaning emigration. Very natural it is that they should do so. Reduce, compress the cotton trade by taking away its working power, and reducing their wages expenditure, say 1/5 or 5 millions, and what then would happen to the class above, the small shopkeepers, and what of the rents, the cottage rents? Trace out the effects upwards to the small farmer, the better householder, and the landowner, and say if there could be any suggestion more suicidal to all classes of the country than by enfeebling a nation, by exporting the best of its manufacturing population, and destroying the value of some of its most productive capital and enrichment. I advise a loan of 5 or 6 million sterling, extending it maybe over 2 or 3 years, administered by special commissioners added to the boards of guardians in the cotton districts under special legislative regulations, enforcing some occupation or labor as a means of keeping up at least the moral standard of the recipients of the loan. Can anything be worse for landowners or masters than parting with the best of the workers, and demoralizing and disappointing the rest by an extended depletive emigration, a depletion of capital and value in an entire province, unquote. Potter, the chosen mouthpiece of the manufacturers, distinguishes two sorts of, quote, machinery, each of which belongs to the capitalist, and of which one stands in their factory, the other at nighttime and on Sundays is housed outside the factory in cottages. The one is inanimate, the other living. The inanimate machinery not only wears out and depreciates from day to day, but a great part of it becomes so quickly superannuated by constant technical progress that it can be replaced with advantage by new machinery after a few months. The living machinery, on the contrary, gets better the longer it lasts, and in proportion as the skill, handed from one generation to another, accumulates. The Times answered the cotton lord as follows, quote, Mr. Edmund Potter is so impressed with the exceptional and supreme importance of the cotton masters that, in order to preserve this class and perpetuate their profession, he would keep 500,000 of the laboring class confined in a great moral workhouse against their will. Is the trade worth retaining? Asks Mr. Potter. Certainly, by all honest means, it is, we answer. Is it worthwhile keeping the machinery in order? Again asks Mr. Potter. Here we hesitate. By the machinery, Mr. Potter means the human machinery, for he goes on to protest that he does not mean to use them as an absolute property. We must confess that we do not think it worthwhile or even possible to keep the human machinery in order, that is, to shut it up and keep it oiled until it's wanted. Human machinery will rust under inaction, oil and rub it as you may. Moreover, the human machinery will, as we've just seen, get the steam up of its own accord and burst or run amok in our great towns. It might, as Mr. Potter says, require some time to reproduce the workers, but having machinists and capitalists at hand, we could always find thrifty, hard, industrious men wherewith to improvise more master manufacturers than we can ever want. Mr. Potter talks of the trade reviving in, quote, 1, 2, or 3 years, and he asks us not to, quote, encourage or allow the working power to emigrate. Footnote, Parliament did not vote a single farthing in aid of emigration, but simply passed some acts empowering the municipal corporations to keep the operatives in a half-starved state, i.e. to exploit them at less than the normal wages. On the other hand, when 3 years later the cattle disease broke out, Parliament broke wildly through its usages and voted straight off millions for indemnifying the millionaire landlords, whose farmers in any event came off without loss owing to the rise in the price of meat. The bull-like bellow of the landed proprietors at the opening of Parliament in 1866 showed that a man can worship the cow Sabala without being a Hindu, and can change himself into an ox without being a Jupiter. Back to the main text where we conclude the Times' response to Potter. He says that it is very natural the workers should wish to emigrate, but he thinks that in spite of their desire, the nation ought to keep this 500,000 of workers, with their 700,000 dependents, shut up in the cotton districts. And as a necessary consequence, he must of course think that the nation ought to keep down their discontent by force, and sustain them by alms, upon the chance that the cotton masters may someday want them. The time has come when the great public opinion of these islands must operate to save this working power from those who would deal with it as they would deal with iron and coal and cotton, unquote. The Times article was only a witty jest. The so-called great public opinion was in fact of Mr. Potter's opinion, that the factory operatives are part of the movable fittings of a factory. Their emigration was prevented. They were locked up in that moral workhouse, the cotton districts, and they form, as before, the strength of the cotton manufacturers of Lancashire. Capitalist production, therefore, of itself reproduces the separation between labor power and the means of labor. It thereby reproduces and perpetuates the condition for exploiting the laborer. It incessantly forces them to sell their labor power in order to live, and enables the capitalist to purchase labor power in order that they may enrich themselves. Footnote quoting Sismondi, the worker required the means of subsistence to live, the boss required labor to make a profit. Back to the main text. It is no longer a mere accident that capitalist and laborer confront each other in the market as buyer and seller. It's the process itself that incessantly hurls back the laborer onto the market as a vendor of their labor power, and that incessantly converts their own product into a means by which another person can purchase them. In reality, the laborer belongs to capital before they have sold themselves to capital. Comment, in other words, and this pertains to the discussion about productive versus unproductive consumption as well, this is why we use the concept of the dictatorship or overall class rule of the capitalist class or bourgeoisie. In other words, capitalism is not just a process here that is happening, it is fundamental to all of the dynamics in that society. Capitalist domination of society through capitalist control of the major productive processes implies a lot of other things about the entirety of the contents of that society, the whole population, etc. that while capitalists are in charge and in control of society, even your consumption, which you think is for your personal enjoyment, is really ultimately for them. The only way that you can change that is by removing them from control of society. Continuing, the laborer's economic bondage is both brought about and concealed by the periodic sale of themselves, by their change of masters, and by the oscillations in the market price of labor power. 2 footnotes here, first about the bondage of the laborer. A boorishly clumsy form of this bondage exists in the county of Durham. This is one of the few counties in which circumstances do not secure to the farmer undisputed proprietary rights over the agricultural laborer. The mining industry allows the latter some choice. In this county, the farmer, contrary to the custom elsewhere, rents only such farms as have on them laborers' cottages. The rent of the cottage is a part of the wages. These cottages are known as hinds houses. They are let to the laborers in consideration of certain feudal services, under a contract called bondage, which, amongst other things, binds the laborer during the time they're employed elsewhere to leave someone, say their daughter, etc., to supply their place. The laborer themselves is called a bondsman. The relationship here set up also shows how individual consumption by the laborer becomes consumption on behalf of capital, or productive consumption from quite a new point of view. Quoting the Public Health Report 7, 1864, it is curious to observe that the very dung of the hind and bondsman is the prerequisite of the calculating lord, and the lord will allow no privy but his own to exist in the neighborhood, and will rather give a bit of manure here and there for a garden than bate any part of his seigneurial right." Unquote. And the second footnote regarding the concealment of the laborer's economic bondage by the periodic sale of themselves, etc. It will not be forgotten that with respect to the labor of children, etc., even the formality of a voluntary sale disappears. Back to the main text. Capitalist production, therefore, under its aspect of a continuous connected process, of a process of reproduction, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capitalist relation. On the one side, the capitalist, on the other, the wage laborer. And a final footnote quoting from Marx's Wage Labor and Capital. Capital presupposes wage labor, and wage labor presupposes capital. One is a necessary condition to the existence of the other. They mutually call each other into existence. Does an operative in a cotton factory produce nothing but cotton goods? No, they produce capital. They produce values that give fresh command over their labor, and that, by means of such command, create fresh values. Unquote. The articles published under the above title are parts of some lectures given by Marx on that subject in 1847 in the German Arbeiterverein at Brussels, the publication of which was interrupted by the Revolution of February. And that is the end of Chapter 23, Simple Reproduction. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can do a one-time or a recurring donation, and every contribution is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time researching, planning, recording, producing, promoting the content of this channel, replying to comments, and all the other things that are involved in actually bringing it to life. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. It really does help. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And word on the street about that these days is that it prefers things that are 8 to 10 words in length. I don't know if that's true, but I keep hearing it. And finally, remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life. So make sure to take what you've learned here into the real world and apply it in your real world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.